Please become a patron of Myth Vision Podcast. Get access to everything early. Help us grow. Ian Mills, New Testament review podcast host, of course, and go subscribe to his YouTube channel down in the description, the Patreon, all that good stuff. You guys should be done by then. I'm really pressing him to have that Patreon done. I have to. But also your PhD candidate at Duke University and New Testament stuff, anything Christian related, really, you are all over, and I really enjoyed these interviews. What is the Messianic Secret?
Yeah, the Messianic Secret is a concept that's associated with the scholarship of William Wrede. In 1901, William Wrede published a book identifying a motif in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, more than any other Gospel, in sometimes the same story, it'll be in the Gospel of Mark, but not in these other Gospels, there is a motif of secrecy. Jesus comes into the synagogue, heals the demoniac, and sends him away and says, "Don't tell anyone." Jesus.
I love this story, by the way.
Oh yeah, no, and over and over again. He raises the daughter from the dead and says, "Don't tell anyone who I am." The demons recognize him. He can do miracles for people, but he is constantly and he's repeatedly telling people not to tell others who he is, not to tell people about Jesus. And that's kind of weird, right? Now, this book, William Wrede's book, is super important. It's sort of the forefather of literary narrative approaches to the Gospels, starting to ask, instead of just like assuming that the chronology, the order of the Gospels was just how it happened in the real world, which is already itself problematic, of course, no matter what your hermeneutic of Scripture is, because Mark, Matthew, and Luke explicitly rearrange the same stories, the sequence of the stories. But anyways, instead of asking just why did it happen this way, Reda got scholars to start asking, why did they write it this way? At the same time, Reda, looking at the way Matthew and Luke change this motif of secrecy in their own Gospels, and also the way Mark seems to be handling earlier traditions about Jesus, becomes the forefather of redaction criticism. And redaction criticism is focusing on how an author rewrites their sources. So if you want to pick up a copy of, you can pick up J.R.R. Tolkien's drafts of The Lord of the Rings in Christopher Tolkien's The History of Middle-earth series, right? And you can see how he rewrites drafts of this. And one of the things you can see in that is you can see how Tolkien's own conception of things is changing, the things he wants to emphasize, the things he wants to downplay. Well, you can do the same thing looking at the way anybody rewrites an older story. To take a more biblical example, Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews rewrites the entire Jewish scriptures, and does so in a way that's really appealing to a Roman audience, because he's writing for Romans. So you can do the same thing with the way Matthew and Luke rewrite Mark, and Reda, fascinatingly, tries to do that with the way Mark rewrites his traditions, the traditions he's gotten about Jesus. Of course, we don't have access to those, so Reda has to be looking within the gospel itself. Now, Vreda's solution to the Messianic Secret, Vreda's explanation for the Messianic Secret, almost no one agrees anymore. It is almost universally rejected. So what's his answer? Why have people rejected it? And what are people saying now? So the answer before Wrede was that Messianic Secret is Jesus slowly teaching the disciples about his identity and that he's going to die. The problem with that construction is Mark 2, very beginning, Jesus says, "I'm going to die." It comes up from the very beginning. Moreover, the Messianic Secret, on the earlier conception, is Jesus correcting a false belief of the disciples about Jesus. But that's not what's happening in the Gospel of Mark. On the contrary, Jesus is silencing people, keeping people from teaching true things about him, that he is the Son of God. So that doesn't work either, right? This is all Vreda's points, and I think these are points that Wrede is right about. Wrede gets all this right. And we go look at Mark 4, which we call the parable, the theory of parables in Mark, where Mark explains why Jesus teaches in parables. And he says he does this so that they would not turn and believe.
Yeah.
It's not to correct a false belief. It's to prevent them from having a true belief. So that problematizes pre-Wrede theories.
Watch out, Calvinists. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I think that's actually also a misreading of the text, but we can come there in a bit. But Wrede's answer, which again nobody accepts anymore, is that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah. Nobody thought Jesus was the Messiah until after he died and the resurrection event happened, and after Jesus rose from the dead. So Wrede's theory, again, which no one really accepts anymore, is that Jesus was a sort of teacher, a sort of a charismatic figure, maybe a miracle worker, and then he was killed, and the Christians, early Jesus followers, believed he was raised from the dead, and they said, he must have been the Messiah, and went back and said, but they had a problem, because nobody who knew Jesus thought he was the Messiah, because he never claimed to be, according to this theory. So they said, the reason nobody knew about this until after Jesus rose from the dead was because Jesus kept it a secret. And so there we have Wrede's explanation for the Messianic Secret. According to Reda, the secret was introduced into the Gospel of Mark to explain why nobody believed Jesus was the Messiah until after he died and rose from the dead.
That's good for 1901.
That's good for 1901, maybe. Actually, it's not very good for 1901.
Really?
It's a bad theory.
Okay.
So there's a lot of reasons about theory. I mean, one of the most influential arguments that people will usually start with is that dying and being raised from the dead is not part of the expectations for Jewish messiahs. It's not part of the grammar of messianism. There is nothing about a teacher dying and being raised from the dead that would make you say, he must have been the Messiah. In fact, that's the opposite of what's supposed to happen to the Messiah.
The Davidic Messiah is supposed to conquer.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole conversation about the complexities of messiahship. Messiah seems to be is just the word anointed. It's used to describe the agents of Jesus doing various things. Sometimes, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's a purely religious or ritual function. Sometimes it is in fact military, like you said, the Davidic Messiah. The point is, nowhere do we have any discussion of the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, dying and rising from the dead. So this creates a problem for Wrede's theory, because his theory is that he starts getting called the Messiah after he dies and raises from the dead. But there's no connection there. The other thing is, there's just a ton of evidence from the Gospels themselves that Jesus identified himself as a messianic figure during his life. How does Jesus get killed is one of these big things. Like, Romans are not executing people. I mean, they're not crucifying people for sure, but they're not executing people, period, for teaching that you should love your neighbor. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not a controversial claim. And even if it was a controversial claim, like, someone claiming to be more important than the temple, or something like that, which I'm not saying Jesus taught that, but even a claim that that as controversial as that is not going to get you executed, is not going to get you crucified by the Romans. Crucifixion is not something you do to troublemakers. It's not something you do to your ordinary criminal. Crucifixion is a public advertisement of what happens when you challenge the power of Rome. And so whatever Jesus was doing, it was interpreted by the Romans as a confrontation to their imperial power. And so you need someone who's doing more than teaching about the kingdom of God and the love for your neighbor and the marginalized and self-sacrifice. You need someone who's challenging the authority of Rome. And we can add on, I can go down this rabbit trail for a long time talking about the really strong evidence that Jesus was understood as an apocalyptic figure, was understood as a messianic figure, which just means
E.P. Sanders.
Oh, very much. E.P. Sanders, Dale Allison. We can go down the road of Jesus as apocalyptic prophet. That is, Jesus was for sure. I think it is not controversial anymore. I mean, since Schweitzer probably, but it is not controversial at all anymore to say that Jesus was understood as someone who understood himself, who understood his purpose as bringing about the kingdom of God. I think we need to be careful with what we mean by Messiah. It means anointed. It's applied to lots of figures. So to say that Jesus understood himself as the anointed one of God who's bringing about the kingdom of the world. And that's what we should call a Messiah. And so Wrede's theory is bad. Or Wrede's theory doesn't work. It doesn't explain it. Another huge problem just with Wrede's theory is if the point of the Messianic Secret is to explain why nobody thinks Jesus is the Messiah before he's crucified, you go back and read those stories, the first thing that happens in every single story, immediately after Jesus says, don't tell anyone, is it says, the person went off and told everyone. The Messianic Secret never works according to the Gospel of Mark. And so that's a terrible thing for the editor of Mark on Wrede's theory to have inserted, because that's explicitly contradicting what Wrede says is the point. If Wrede needs, according to Wrede's theory, that's being put into the Gospel of Mark to prevent people from knowing, why would it always be a failure? Why would it immediately go and tell everyone? So I think there's actually a much better explanation for what the Messianic Secret is doing as part of the project of the teaching of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark. And I don't want to go into this too much, but I think the giveaway, is there is one time in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus doesn't command secrecy, but instead says, go tell everyone. And that's the demoniac in the Decapolis, where Jesus, and it is the one time where Jesus is in Gentile territory. And so I think what we have here is Mark 4, if this is going to be our key to understanding what the secret's point is, to keep them from turning on understanding, it's a quotation of Isaiah. It's the same passage from Isaiah that Paul uses in Romans 9 when he's talking about the election, when he's talking about that Israel has been temporarily blinded so that the Gentiles could be brought in. What we see when we go to the Gospel of Mark, that there is this sort of secrecy that's keeping certain people from understanding, except for when Jesus is in Gentile territory. And so it is the Pauline strand, it is the Pauline narrative of salvation being played out in the life of Jesus.
Wow.
Now, you can't you can't oversimplify this, because of course Jesus is Jewish, the disciples are Jewish.
Got it.
This is not a racial thing, but this is the narrativization, the narrative of the election of the Gentiles, I think. And I think there's other evidence of this throughout the Gospel of Mark, and I've been hoping to publish that. I wrote this up, but I haven't gotten around to that yet.
Dude, you do know you just set a bomb off, and you know that you can't just do that and walk away, man.
Well, we don't want to go into a discussion of Pauline theology.
No, I know. It's exciting hearing that, because look, I don't take the conclusions of these and run off and go, yeah, Jews are bad people. No.
Well, hold on. Yeah, that is not what Paul is saying. That is not what Mark is saying. These are. There is a conflict with certain leaders in the Jewish people, and Paul is upset that his own people have not accepted this proclamation of Jesus to the extent that he wants them to. Obviously, there are lots of Jews who are in Paul's church as Jewish people. So no, this is not.
You see this constant pattern taking place, and this pattern is something sounds like this, or it can even be a little bit like I've had this discussion with Rabbi Tovia Singer, and of course he thinks Matthew is anti-Jewish, and you're like, what? Now here's his logic. Notice, and this is just an example, I don't want to get rabbit trailed, we said we weren't going to do that, but I think this is important noting, that the angel or the star is leading them to the Messiah.
Yes.
They stop at Herod's palace.
Yes.
Herod wants to kill the kid.
That's right.
He's like, there's a GPS right above your head. Why are you stopping to ask, do you know where the Messiah is, when the star is leading him directly to it? So he's like...
The mechanics of the star is very tricky.
But I guess what his point is saying, and I don't know if this is true, but this is coming from a Jewish perspective. He's saying, don't you see? They're trying to put the blame on... They're constantly pointing at how the dim-witted Jews don't see it, this, that. Well, I don't know if it's all Jews, even though he thinks that it is because Herod's the king of them. But the leadership is clearly being pointed at.
Yes, there is a conflict with leadership.
It goes from just leadership of Jews to real easy to make that step and go, Jews. You see what that problem?
Well, that happened in the history of Christianity, right. And this is the major problem. I am a practicing, believing, confessing Christian,
right.
And one of the darkest parts of my faith tradition is the long legacy of anti-Judaism, which became
though, right?
absolutely, which became anti-Semitism, of course, once we get racialize theories of Judaism. And this is something that Christians should own up to, and this is something that Christians need to reckon with and need to talk about when we are talking about the conflict between a Jewish Palestinian Jesus, a Jewish Pharisee Paul, and other Jewish leaders. And we need to be careful how we're talking about that, and we need to talk about the implications of that, what it means, really own and reckon with this history, this dark history of anti-Judaism in the Christian tradition. And I think it's ethically, morally irresponsible to discuss these passages without flagging that.
Thank you for saying that. I do want to ask one comment about the Pauline stuff. That theory, I love it, by the way. Paul is seeping his way into this because it makes sense. Well, not only it makes sense from Paul's own bickering, so to speak, going on in Romans, like they just aren't listening. I personally, of course, take Acts to be a mythologized narrative of potentially Paul really being, kind of slandered by the Jewish leadership at the time, saying, we're not listening to this. You're French for sure. Like, you're not in the group of what we're talking about here. Paul's probably being mistreated with his message, I suspect.
I think actually Acts is giving a much more subtle depiction of Paul than you're giving him credit for. Because why is Paul persecuted when Paul gets in trouble? The cause of it usually is some riot breaks out in the street, and then the leadership steps in to fix things. And that's exactly the kinds of things we see happening in early Christian traditions. That is not authoritarian people coming in and trying to suppress Christianity, but a sort of grassroots, trouble starting, and then authorities step in to try to, keep the peace. Yeah. So I think Acts actually gives us a very nuanced and very plausible account of where Paul's problems come from.
I guess what I'm getting is him being stoned to death and then resurrected and things like that.
That doesn't happen to Paul. Paul's not resurrected in Acts.
I thought that he's near death. He's near death multiple times.
Yeah, but Paul himself tells us that in 1 Corinthians that this has happened to him. He's been flogged. He's been cast out of the synagogues. I mean, this is that's Paul's own writing.
Real stuff does happen. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. I do think that Acts itself, though, is highly fictional in a sense. Well, not saying there isn't historical basis there. A historical fiction, somewhat, is my opinion. That's just and I know that you would take a different stance than me on this. I do think that there's a literary. It's kind of like saying, is there history in the Gospels?
Yep.
Sure, there is. I don't deny that, but. Is there mythology? Is there a narrative that isn't historical taking place there? I would say personally, yeah, there are. Just like in Acts, I would say. But that's just my we're not going to get lost there.
There's narrative in Josephus' War of the Jews, and Josephus was a general fighting that. He was in that war. So I think we need to be careful between saying narrative isn't history. I mean, obviously, there is a narrative construction. There is you have to retell, you have to select, you have to arrange. But I don't draw that line the same way you would.
Right. I think I'm just approaching it skeptical first until I can find any basis. But I do agree with you that there was the way that Jews would discipline other Jews in the synagogue and stuff does match the criteria of being lashed and whatnot.
Well, on that point, just real quick, we're off topic now.
Yes.
But the synagogue doesn't have the authority of the state of the officials. If you are getting lashed by a synagogue, that's something you are doing to continue participation in the synagogue. Right. And so that is something you are subjecting yourself to voluntarily. The synagogue doesn't have a police force that can come get you at your house. So the very intra-synagogue discipline we see evinced shows that these are people who are continuing to participate in synagogue life. And so that very idea of persecution or discipline from Jewish leaders pushes back against the very anti-Judaic notions. Again, I've said this several times, but Paul represents himself as a Pharisee until the very day he died. The Pharisees are not the bad guys. Paul himself is a Pharisee till the very last book of Acts. His letters, he doesn't say, I stopped being a Pharisee. That Paul, the Christian movement is one part of Second Temple Judaism.
So you're with Paula Fredrickson on this big time.
I have my own disagreements with Paul Fredrickson. We've done a whole New Testament review episode on it. But I think there's a lot to be said. Oh yeah, there's a lot to be said. I mean, I don't necessarily own all of the Paul within Judaism readings of Romans or Galatians, but there's a lot to be said for Christianity as a species of Second Temple Judaism.
Makes a lot of sense. So last question I have, and trying to insert the needle back into the vein.
The Messianic Secret?
In some way, yeah. Is there any, according to when we're reading this, and we're seeing Pauline kind of, this example that comes from a Pauline idea, do you think Jesus, in real history, had, like, let's say Q. Let's suppose Q, or not. I'm not trying to interject the concept of Q, saying that there's a Q document. I'm saying the tradition prior to Mark, whatever it is, I'll just say Q for those.
Q is Matthew and Luke's common source that is not Mark, that some people believe in, not the conspiracy theory that has to do with the election of Trump.
Right. Yes, take that somewhere else. But do you think that the reason that this shows up in Mark might be because Jesus probably did meet adversaries, Pharisees and such. So there's this kind of like, that's true historically. At the same time, the like I'm not even going to tell them, is enhanced by Paul's theology. Yeah, no, I think there was real conflict between Jesus and Jewish leadership. And I think why the Pharisees get singled out, especially in Matthew so much, is because you have the hottest fights, the biggest fights with the people who are most similar to you. And this couldn't be more true of Matthew. Matthew is the gospel that looks most Pharisaical. In fact, Matthew is the only gospel where Jesus says, you should follow the teachings of the Pharisees, but not their practices. And yet, it's also the gospel that over and over has Jesus in conflict with the Pharisees. And I think that's typical. It is the people who you have disagreements with, but are otherwise the most similar, that you are most invested in drawing distinctions with and creating conflicts with. You don't fight with people who you have no common ground with. So no, I think there is definitely conflicts, and definitely how that plays into secrecy is a more complicated conversation, and that's a bit tricky. But there's some good work done on that, so that's a extra. Interesting.
I don't think we have time for that.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.